Chapter 51. Were you the one who beat up Zhou Chao? 1. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. The south entrance of the Air Pavilion is where the staff goes in and out. To put it bluntly, it's the back entrance. In contrast to the lively east entrance, the road leading to the south entrance was more deserted. Coupled with the malfunctioning street lamp, it added a bit of an eerie atmosphere. When she met Yan Cheng's deep eyes, Chen Jinyao was startled for a moment, but she wasn't unable to handle a joke like this. Only, the tip of her nose was red from the cold and she couldn't help but move her legs. After a while, she finally stuttered, "Your ancestor." Tisk, the man shrugged, surrendering. He moved away from the wall and went over, taking off his jacket for Chen Jinyao while saying to her, "Well, don't catch a cold then, ancestor." They didn't arrive at the bar's hall after going through the south entrance. Instead, it was a rather short corridor separated by a wall with 2 doors on each side. But you could hear the clamor and the noise inside. The revelry had already begun. A band was probably playing on the stage and the songs sung by that husky voice were enough to impregnate a person's ears. Chen Jinyao listened to it and yet had time to feel shocked at how good the Air Pavilion singers were when she was pulled into the other door by Yan Cheng. Through the door was a spiral staircase. Yan Cheng told her, "Upstairs from here is my lounge." Subconsciously, Chen Jinyao squinted. She made a conjecture as his legal wife, wouldn't it be quite easy to hide a lover here? At the end of the stairs was a short corridor with a sliding door at the end. The light in the lounge was bright and dazzling. The moment the door was pushed open, Yan Cheng paused and turned to look at her for a few moments, looking her up and down under the light. After he was done checking out her clothes and makeup, he withdrew his gaze. "Yeah, you're the little lover I'm sneaking in here." After a pause, he smirked. "My wife doesn't look like you." The current Chen Jinyao and the old her were practically 2 different people. "So why don't you let me take the east entrance?" When she mentioned that, Chen Jinyao recalled the figure that passed her by earlier and raised a brow, taking her jacket off and returning it to Yan Cheng. The room was warm. "I was hoping to be able to blend into the dance floor." Upon hearing that, Yan Cheng pondered. "Do you want me to accompany you through the east gate again?" "Whatever you want to do, you can go down later from this side too." "No, thank you." Chen Jinyao rejected Yan Cheng's good intentions. It was just a pretext when she mentioned she came for an inspection. Now that she's here, she thought that she should indulge in the nightlife. That singing voice from before was still stuck in her ear, so she wanted to go downstairs and order a song. After pondering, she patted Yan Cheng's shoulder, saying meaningfully, "Who comes to a bar and still wants to be burdened by family?" She shouldn't have texted him in the afternoon and went for the surprise attack. Now look, she can't even shake him off anymore. Yan Cheng was insistent on staying with her. But she really couldn't tolerate that insistence. Tai knocked on the door and entered the lounge. He looked bothered and was stunned for a moment when he saw Chen Jinyao there. After a while, he withdrew his gaze. Even his business tone wasn't too great. "Boss, Zhou Shui is here. She says she wants to see you. She says she has to see you." It felt like he was sitting on pins and needles when he said this. Chen Jinyao raised a brow and looked at Yan Cheng with interest. She thought to herself, so she really didn't see it wrong after all. "Go, take care of it." She laid his palm out and excused Tai. Then, she blinked her eyes at Yan Cheng. Tai, who was good at reading the mood, was stunned. Chapter 52. Were you the one who beat up Zhou Chao? 2. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. Yan Cheng raised a brow. "I thought you'd want to go up for the fight yourself." Chen Jinyao laughed and said, "If I've got the time to tear someone up I might as well try out some cocktails instead." "Oh, if you can't deal with it, then you don't have to go home tonight." It was a scene of red lanterns and green wine, people moving and twisting. Men and women alike were venting their stress, unrestrained in their heartiness. On stage, a song ends, and people underneath were cheering and begging for another song. Chen Jinyao ordered a glass of light alcohol and took a sip before gradually shifting her gaze to the lead singer. Looking up, she moved her eyes to a certain compartment. Women aren't always honest with themselves after all. Standing next to her was Ah Tai. Yen Cheng had sent him to watch over her. Even though the air pavilion had been ordered to rectify their behavior, there was no guarantee that a few people would come to play with less than pure intentions. With a bit of alcohol in their minds, a man could go pretty outrageous things. In short, Ah Tai's role was to prevent Chen Jinyao from being accosted by men. Chen Jinyao sighed and beckoned Ah Tai closer. "Hey, go help me spy on things a little, will you?" There was a moment of silence between them. Ah Tai looked serious and said to her, "I think it's better if you go personally." Zhou Shui walked up the stairs to the first private compartment. There were multi-colored lights lit within the compartment. She took a seat on the sofa and the smile on her face had stiffened, but she was still watching Yen Cheng with her dark eyes. She had indeed come to see him for Zhou Chao's matter. At the same time, there were other psychological factors as well. Zhou Shui had confidence of her place in Yen Cheng's heart even after not seeing each other for a few months. She had already gotten used to it. She had been using men to achieve her goals since she was in middle school, and a man's willingness to satisfy her patted her pride. She also took it for granted that Yen Cheng would accept any request as long as she asked of it, even if he had a problem with Zhou Chao. But at this moment, under Yen Cheng's false smile and almost mocking gaze, Zhou Shui felt her heart drumming and she unconsciously pursed her lips, tugging at the corner of her jacket. "Yen Cheng, you're coming here all thick-faced and expecting me to bow down to you. So what, you came here to scrounge some food off me for that useless cousin of yours?" With her knuckles turning white, Zhou Shui bit her lip and lowered her tone, sounding a bit wronged. "Yen Cheng, you weren't like this before. I thought you knew what you amounted to." The man leaned forward with his legs crossed, elbow on his knees and hand on his chin, narrowing his eyes. No hint of emotion could be found in his voice, but it sounded a bit cold. Zhou Shui was completely stunned. Under the mottled light and shadows, Yen Cheng looked gloomy. After a while, Zhou Shui rubbed the back of her hand. When she looked up again, she saw a smile on Yen Cheng's lips. It was as if that earlier gloominess was just an illusion. She gulped and could vaguely sense that something was wrong. Heh. Yen Cheng sneered. When he starts putting in his weight, not many people can match him when it came to having a venomous tongue. "What, you really think of yourself as some goddess? You really think I liked you? Zhou Shui, did you really think I didn't see through those thoughts of yours in college?" He barely said much but Zhou Shui's complexion had already turned bad. Her face was pale but she didn't respond. Chapter 53. Were you the one who beat up Zhou Chao? 3. You are listening at novelfull.audio. For people like Zhou Shui who was so determined to fly up the branch and turn into a phoenix, marrying rich was almost the only way out she could think of. And, at that time, she was fortunate enough to have gone to school with a few rich guys. She couldn't predict what Hua Qidong felt towards her, which gave her a great sense of crisis. She wasn't so sure she could catch Hua Qidong at that time, so she went for the wide net approach and successfully got into the noble circle of the capital, mingling with those people from the upper circle. Out of all those people during that time, it seemed like Yen Cheng was the only one who turned a cold shoulder to her. Memories came flooding back. Zhou Shui's face turned from green to white, and back again. After that, it seemed that Hua Qidong and Yen Cheng were competing in a college project. Yen Cheng won over Hua Qidong and had a better reputation than him in school. Then, they had more disagreements outside of that. They were young then and it was easy to get passionate when you're young and filled with vigor. Hua Qidong's pettiness made it so that he would fight Yen Cheng at everything. In the end, a rumor suddenly came out in school that Yan Cheng was chasing after Zhou Shui. Zhou Shui also found out at that time that Hua Qidong was starting to be nice to her again. Yan Cheng's pursuit of Zhou Shui seemed to stem from her casting the net first. He went along with her intentions. Then, he never expected Hua Qidong to be stupid enough to get confused and was really brainless enough to try and snatch everything from him. He also married Zhou Shui, much to his surprise. Ah, well, it was a shotgun wedding. Only, it seems that this son seems to have been aborted a few days after Zhou Shui got married. TSK. Yan Qing held up his wine glass, leisurely swirling the red wine inside. Once the jack-in-the-box was open, there was no need to hide him back up again. He licked his upper lip and smirked, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. It even looked a bit demeaning. But you should thank me after all. Without me, you wouldn't be able to become Mrs. Hua. Zhou Shui's body went cold. Even now she was in disbelief. She raised her head fiercely to look at him. After seeing the expression on his face, she shut her mouth again, unable to say anything. At a time like this, Zhou Shui suddenly discovered that Yan Cheng was a little scary. Licking her lips, a thought seemed to pop up in her mind. After latching onto it, she asked, "Were you the one who beat up Zhou Chao?" Yan Cheng pondered for a moment at that, but his expression was unchanged as he answered, "No, indeed, it wasn't. But the one who did was right outside." A small crack was slightly opened in the door to the compartment. Chen Jinyao didn't come to peek, but she sent Ah Tai instead. Since Ah Tai was ordered to watch after Chen Jinyao, he didn't dare to leave her, so Chen Jinyao asked him to eavesdrop instead. That made sure that only you, I, and God knew what happened here. Eventually, after struggling for a few moments, Ah Tai buckled down and joined Chen Jinyao's camp. At the same time, he apologized to himself for thinking that Chen Jinyao was open-minded and considerate. And thus he concluded. Women never mean what they say. Some things should end it there. Yan Qing didn't have the patience to drag this on with Zhou Shui either. He raised his brow and set aside the wine glass, got up slowly, and slowly fastened his left sleeve cuff. Under the dim lights, he looked down at her from up above with his eyes lowered, the coldness within maddening. After a while, he finally spoke, "If I were you, I'd latch onto Hua Qidong as desperately as I can. After all, you won't find another catch once you get divorced with him." Chapter 54. I want to give you a reward. 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. It felt like her mask of hypocrisy was being torn off. After sitting in the dark for so long, her first reaction was to dodge it when the light hit her eyes. In such a straightforward dialogue, Zhou Shui was no match for Yan Cheng. She thought that she was twisting this man around her pinky, but it was the complete opposite. It was just an illusion that came from her own self-deception. In reality, she was just a laughing stock in Yan Cheng's eyes. Zhou Shui didn't dare to look directly into his eyes. She lowered her gaze and bit her lip. She was digging at her thighs with her fingers and felt so angry, but she couldn't say anything. She had completely lost her self-confidence. But after thinking about it, she had to admit that what Yan Qing said makes sense. The lights were flickering back and forth. Yan Qing thought for a moment and massaged his nose bridge. He suddenly kept away his mean streak and raised a corner of his lips with indifference. "Right, I'll give you one more tip. Pay less attention to those relatives of yours like Zhou Chao and you'll have a better time staying in Mrs. Hua's seat." Following that was a long few minutes of silence. Then, Yan Qing narrowed his eyes and ordered his guest to leave. Zhou Shui came in like a peacock with a sense of pride higher than that of normal people, but now that pride was completely destroyed. All that surrounded her was a wretched mess. She just had a big blow to her pride, and she was the one who sent herself up to have that happen. At the end of it, she was still embarrassed. She got up abruptly, grabbed her handbag off the sofa and rushed straight out. Her carelessness caused her to bang her knee on the coffee table. The pain came so abruptly that it caused her to frown and hiss in pain. She immediately stopped and bent her knee. The door of the compartment shook imperceptibly. When Ah Tai came back to his senses from his shock, he ended his eavesdropping behavior with a look of disbelief and prepared to go downstairs to look for Chen Jinhao. At that moment, Chen Jinhao was clapping her hands along with the others around her, giving a round of applause to the singer who was working hard on the stage. Xiao Chongxi and Chai Yu just happened to be sitting on the vacant seats next to her. It was already this late and these two came late. They would have come running up to the second floor usually, but Chai Yu had a keen eye and was able to spot Chen Jinhao who was being accosted by a man while she was at the bar with her drink. And that's why we have this scene now. The original noisy environment instantly got louder as the track changed suddenly to a rock song with drums, electric guitar, and the likes. Sister.in.law Chai Yu was good at livening up the atmosphere. He withdrew his gaze from the stage and narrowed his eyes, raising his voice to ask, "Does Yan Qing know you're here?" Chen Jinhao turned her head and nodded without hesitation. So he's still hiding in the lounge and not coming out. Chai Yu pretended to be alarmed. He had the look of a troublemaker on his face, the classic provocateur face. What's with that? He should come down here and accompany you. Ever since getting to know each other over a meal, Chai Yu stopped being a stranger to Chen Jinhao. And, having seen how Yan Qing treats her, he could also deduce what sort of jokes he could make and what sort he couldn't. Xiao Chongxi frowned and felt that Chai Yu had crossed the line. He glared at him as a reminder but then he met his indifferent gaze. Xiao Chongxi pursed his lips but still didn't say anything in the end. Not long after, he lit a cigarette. Well, Zhou Shui came to look for him. Since he's here to tease her, then he better not blame her for teasing him back. At the very least, she was able to make him shut up in an instant. Chapter 55. I want to give you a reward, too. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Sure enough, Chai Yu went completely silent. He raised his hand to scratch his head, embarrassed. Compared to the single-brain-cell Chai Yu, Xiao Chongxi was able to vaguely guess the situation, but what interested him more was how this person in front of him with ties to Hua Qidong was reacting. He breathed out a puff of smoke and sighed. Probably since Xiao Chongxi's probing gaze was too hot to ignore. Chen Jinhao turned to look at him. After a few seconds, she simply decided to look elsewhere. Young men and women were gyrating their bodies closely together on the dance floor. When she saw Chai Yu who seemed like he wanted to speak but didn't at the corner of her eyes, she couldn't help but curve her eyes in amusement and said meaningfully, "There's quite a lot of hotties in the air pavilion, huh?" Chai Yu could keenly sense the crisis coming up in Yan Cheng's place. Not long after, Ah Tai came back with information. He had a profound expression but upon observation, you could tell he was incredulous. Zhou Shui really banged her knee. There was a red patch underneath her stockings where she had been hit. The pain quickly spread to her nerves, instantly stimulating her tear ducts. Tears lingered in her eyes but they were forced back by the indifferent voice behind her before they could even fall out. Yan Cheng, you better keep your mouth shut. I don't want to hear any more gossip about me or my wife. She turned around to look at him out of reflex. The man didn't even look at her and suddenly laughed. Otherwise, it won't end as simply as your cousin being hospitalized. Zhou Shui's heart jumped and she was frozen in place. She dropped her gaze and murmured, didn't you just say that you weren't the one who hired someone to beat Zhou Chao up? Yan Cheng, indeed, I'm not. But that might not be the case next time. He narrowed his eyes at her and warned. You'd better understand where you stand. If not, even your status as Mrs. Huo won't be able to save you. Enough, stop looking all pitiful. Leave. Yan Qing didn't care about looking like a gentleman if he wanted to go for it. Ah Tai was like an old man who couldn't stop. He wouldn't let a single line go and recounted the images he managed to peek on. At the end, he even lamented, "For a moment, I thought I saw second young master Yen." Yen Cheng was the fourth eldest at home with 4 siblings. The second young master was the most profound one, and also the one best suited to take over the Yen family. He's quite good at the weak act, huh? Keeps their guard down. Xiao Chongxi raised a brow and smirked. Chen Jinniao never expected to be able to hold her alcohol so well. Even though she clearly selected the one with the lowest alcohol content as a precautionary selection, the taste was also excellent and quite sweet. She couldn't stop after trying one sip. Without anyone watching her, she began to go for cup after cup. The more she drank, the happier she felt, and the more she drank. By the time she came to realize it, the alcohol was already getting to her. Her head swayed left and right and her sight was starting to get woozy. She felt dizzy, so she just laid down at the bar. The glass surface of the bar was quite cool and it felt so comfortable when she pressed her hot cheek to that cool surface that her eyes narrowed in pleasure. She was muttering softly but nobody could hear what she was saying. Just like that, after turning quiet, she instantly shrunk her presence. The 3 men beside her all had their own topics to talk about and naturally didn't pay attention to her. Even if they did, they would just think that she was laying down cause she was tired from all the fun. Yen Qing bumped into a part-time female employee when he left the compartment. Red wine was spilled all over his jacket. Chapter 56. I want to give you a reward. 3. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The employee bowed down and kept on apologizing, but Yen Cheng was frowning, seemingly not in the best of moods. Even if it was just a part-timer, they would have gone through training with the manager before starting work at the air pavilion. The most taboo thing you can do as a service worker is to walk around without looking at where you're going. He usually wouldn't care about these trivial matters but he was in a hurry to go downstairs today. He kept a cold face and did not accept the employee's apologies, he just walked past her and left. When he got downstairs and found Chen Jinniao, he could tell from a distance that Chen Jinniao was drunk. Her cheeks were red and her eyes were watery. Most importantly, she would open and close her mouth, then she would grin stupidly by herself. Yen Cheng, who had never seen Chen Jinniao like this before, was dumbfounded for a moment. Then, after coming back to his senses, he strode over. What did she drink? Pushing Xiao Chongxi away, Yen Cheng leaned over to pat Chen Jinniao's face. Hello. Birth to Yao Yao. 2 seconds later, she reacted suddenly. That was tantamount to asking a stupid question. He might even make Chen Jinniao mistake that he was scolding her and send a slap across his face out of anger. But that didn't happen. Chen Jinniao bounced up, slid off the barstool, and shot away like an angry bird straight into Yen Cheng's arms, nuzzling her fluffy head on his jacket. Then, when she felt the wet part, Chen Jinniao raised a brow. She still had her basic logic. Looking up, she asked, "Is everything resolved?" Her big eyes blinked brightly. Yen Cheng's Adam's apple bobbed up and down and he uttered a soft hum in response. Chai Yu clicked his tongue. What's with all this lovey-dovey stuff? Yen Cheng shot him a cold glance and didn't bother with him. See ya, Chai Yu. We're heading into a compartment. Chen Jinniao's mind was furious and she couldn't take it. So Zhou Shui found out the truth and lost her mind and poured red wine over you. No, Yen Cheng dropped his gaze. Just bumped into a waitress outside. Oh. Chen Jinniao nodded. A few seconds later, she shook her head like a rattle and a vague scene popped up into her mind. It was just a flash that she wasn't able to catch, but the more she thought about it the more it made her head hurt. She frowned. Since she couldn't remember, she just let it go. She was quiet for 2 minutes. The deafening sound of the music helped move the alcohol circulating in her bloodstream. There was a crowd of voices under the colorful lights. Through the flickering lights, Chen Jinniao tilted her head up to look at Yen Cheng. He looked quite alright and easy to talk to. His jawline was particularly sexy to her and she licked her lips unconsciously. Of course, it's not like she was suddenly getting courageous from the alcohol either. After looking at him for a few seconds, she suddenly pointed to the dance floor and smiled. "Let's go dance." Yan Qing glanced at the 3 empty glasses on the bar and sighed. Singles on the dance floor were indiscriminate and would casually look for intimate dancing partners among them. Many bars are this way, as if it was some sort of unwritten rule. After Yan Qing agreed to Chen Jinyao's request, she couldn't wait to pull Yan Qing over. But before she could even walk a few steps, she stumbled. The cocktail was a good pick for her, but the amount she chugged left much to consider. "Ah, Tai told me all about it." Chen Jinyao wrapped her arms around Yan Cheng's waist. Unlike others who were humping each other enthusiastically, Chen Jinyao's slow and methodical movements really drove him mad. It was very different from her usual aloof and quiet self. "You handled it very well, so I want to give you a reward." Yan Qing ground his teeth and whispered enticingly. "What sort of reward?" Chen Jinyao looked serious. "What about a hot dance?" "Sure." The man's voice turned deep. After 4 or 5 minutes of this slow dance, under the expectant light emanating from Yan Cheng's dark pupils, Chen Jinyao suddenly stopped and said with an even more serious expression. "All right, reward is over." Yan Cheng. Chapter 57. Husband Education Diaries, 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Deep in the night. The curtains of the bedroom weren't drawn too tightly, leaving behind a small gap. The bright moonlight shone in through it, leaving a few sprinklings of silvery dust. The soft light instantly dispersed the darkness in the room. At the end of the bed, unreached by the darkness, half the deep gray blanket had fallen to the floor. 2 pairs of legs with different skin colors intertwined, and the bed also creaked from the intense shaking it endured. The hot room in the air was also filled with a dense and indefinable smell. Who knows how long it took, but after a muffled grunt, everything gradually subsided. Yan Qing buried his face between Chen Jinyao's collarbone, not moving. Soon after, the room began to calm down. Her memories slowly came flowing back. Chen Jinyao felt as if her bones had been dislocated. She couldn't find the slightest bit of energy in her and her face was still beet red as she stared at the ceiling above with dilated pupils. Actually, the room was completely dark. She couldn't see a thing. After her drunken memories flooded back into her mind intermittently, it was being broadcasted in a fragmentary screening mode, but the clips showed the main focus. They say women are more prone to promiscuity after drinking, and that alcohol could strip them of their usual calm and self-conservation. Just as Yan Qing said, she was laughing and smiling at everyone when she was drunk, just like a fool. But of course, that wasn't the main issue here. Point is, she was the one who caused this all to happen. Bluntly speaking, she was the one who started it all. As for the details in the center. First, she could be sure that everything was normal when she was in the air pavilion, and she was really polite because Xiao Chongxi and Chai Yu were there too. Then, they followed them into the compartment and hung around for about an hour or so before finally, unable to hold on from the exhaustion from work during the day, Chen Jinyao was drunk and tired. Yawning, she leaned against Yan Cheng's shoulder, eyes narrowed and sleepy. She almost began to tear up from how tired she was. Then, Yan Qing mentioned that they should be heading home first. It was still a bit early to end the party, but he woke her up and they said their goodbyes to Xiao Chongxi and the others. Before they left the air pavilion properly from the east entrance, they bumped into the air pavilion's manager. Yan Qing seemed to have thought of something. After the manager greeted him respectfully, he called out to him when they were just about to pass each other. There was still a trace of red wine left on his jacket. Looking down, he frowned and said, "Are you the one responsible for the part-timers? Straight out dismiss all the clumsy ones." In fact, he didn't even remember what the employee who bumped into him looked like. He just mentioned it casually as a reminder to the manager to pay attention to the employees and their training. Yan Qing didn't seem to care much about the air pavilion, but in fact, nobody cared about it more than him. In a sense, the air pavilion was his piece of work. Chen Jinyao's car was parked at the air pavilion. She wouldn't drive under the influence and never drank while driving. She came home in Yan Cheng's car. It wasn't so late at night, but still, there weren't many cars at that hour. Yan Cheng must have done some racing before, as he was stepping on the gas and his car was flying on the first half of their trip. Chen Jinyao was dizzy and her heart was beating fast. After cooling her face on the car window for a while, she said, "Drive slower." Tisk, annoying. Even though he said that, he clearly lifted his leg from the pedal a little. We should be taking advantage of the clear roads. After a bout of silence, he glanced sideways at her. Didn't you find it exciting? Chen Jinyao shook her head honestly. Yeah, but it's so exciting that I'm gonna hurl. Alright, straight down to turtle speed now. Chapter 58. Husband Education Diaries, 2, you are listening at novelfull.audio. For the second half of their trip home, the steady speed of the car was successful in making the sleepy Chen Jinyao fall asleep. Once they got home, Yan Cheng parked the car in the underground garage and shut off the engine. Then, when he looked over after taking off his seatbelt, he sighed. He leaned over to wake her up, calling out to her a few times, starting from far to near. When Chen Jinyao finally woke up, she was greeted by Yan Cheng's magnified handsome face that was right in front of her when she opened her sleepy eyes. I thought I wouldn't be able to wake you. Get down if you're awake, you can continue sleeping once you're inside. The deep voice surrounded her three-dimensionally. Chen Jinyao lowered her eyes and the first time that came into her sight was Yan Cheng's Adam's apple that was constantly moving as he spoke. It was a little interesting, she thought. Then, in the next second, she reached out her naughty hands to tease his Adam's apple. When she looked up again, she was met with Yan Cheng's darkening eyes. Compared to his deep eyes, it was clear that his handsome face attracted her more. They were only a few millimeters away and their breaths were intermingling with each other. Chen Jinyao, whose mind was still in chaos, was finally emboldened by the alcohol. After looking at each other for 2 seconds, she slowly reached her hands around Yan Cheng's neck and pulled him down. She was originally planning to reach his mouth while pulling him down for a long kiss, but she must have done it at the wrong strength and angle because she ended up pressing Yan Cheng into her bust instead. She was wearing a dress today, and a thin one at that. Chen Jinyao, Yan Cheng, after the end of that memory, the descriptions of the scene that came after will have to stop here for now. Anyway, she was the one who moved first, and she was actually quite enthusiastic too. Chen Jinyao was almost at tears. Just because of a few glasses of alcohol, she had fed all her reservedness to the dogs. Though they had to go through this sooner or later. Anyway, things just went with nature. Sparse kisses fell on Chen Jinyao's neck. After their battle, Yan Cheng was still a little excited. He wanted to treat this time as an intermission. However, Chen Jinyao was pushing him away because he was too heavy. Don't you think you're being a bit cold to me? Yan Cheng pulled up the quilt that had almost fallen to the ground and covered the two of them, unmoving. Rustling around in under the covers, she reached a fair arm from underneath and wanted to reach the lamp switch, but before she could reach, she was held back by 10 fingers. She had almost sobered up from all the alcohol. Chen Jinyao turned her face away unnaturally and was silent for a moment. More than whether I'm being cold to you or not, I'm more concerned about getting a shower right now. Her body was wet and sticky all over. When he heard that, Yan Cheng raised his brows, his voice sounding a little light-hearted. Sure, but I'm worried you wouldn't be able to get out of bed. Chen Jinyao was expressionless. As long as you let go of me now. Wow, feisty. Are you having some sort of misunderstanding about my capabilities? The man cleared his throat. After a while, he rolled over to the side. Along with that, he turned the lamp on. The alarm clock by the bed showed that it was past 3 in the morning. The room was a mess under the light of the lamp. You changed the bed sheets. Chen Jingyao slowly put on Yan Cheng's shirt and lifted the blanket to get out of bed. Among everything, the messiest part was still the bed. The wet parts were wet, the wrinkles parts were wrinkled, and the smell coming from the blanket was even stronger. Yan Cheng let out a chuckle. He must have thought of something as his expression turned cheerful. You really sacrificed too much to get me to change the sheets. Chen Jingyao was already soft on her feet. Hearing that, she almost fell over. Chapter 59. Husband Education Diaries, 3, you are listening at novelfull.audio. After that, Yan Cheng had an after-sex cigarette by the bed. But he extinguished it after 2 puffs. He got up, took out a set of new bed sheets, and fixed up the bed as well as he could. As long as it was presentable, he was done. Then, he bent over to clean up the clothes strewn across the floor. When he picked up the smaller items, a blush crept up his face. Yan Cheng kept his calm and pursed his lips. Suddenly, he called out, "Honey." "Yeah," she answered from inside, voice a little hoarse. "Wanna go to the movies on Sunday?" After a moment of silence, Chen Jingyao responded, "Sure." This marriage which was hard to define at first was now simple and clear. They can already stamp this as a proper marriage. There were also faintly imperceptible feelings that had slowly begun to grow as they continued to stay together day and night. But due to their habits, none of them noticed it. However, what they did know straight away is that this moonlit night was a sleepless one. The Avengers. Chen Jingyao was teasing Danny with the cat teaser. When she heard that, she turned over to stare at Yan Cheng for a few seconds, then she answered, "Sure. I'll get us tickets for tomorrow afternoon. It'll be just in time for dinner after the movie's over." After some thought, he added, "Then we can go shopping at the night market too. After that, we can still go to Huijiang." She bit her lip. The banks of Huijiang were a mecca for couples because this is the only place in the entire capital where fireworks were allowed to be set off. Yan Cheng passed a level in his game and tossed his phone to the side, stretching his waist. He answered her and asked, "Then what are we doing tomorrow morning? Is this considered a date?" Chen Jingyao rubbed her nose bridge and asked him back. The man replied without thinking. "Of course." When he suggested going to the movies, he had already filed it under a date. It was a shame that the two of them would rather stay at home than go out, mainly because of Chen Jinyao's work. She worked differently than he did, and all she wanted to do in the weekends was lay in bed and recuperate. While he, on the other hand, was more or less adapted to her living pattern. Thinking of this, Yan Cheng, who reacted slower than the world, finally considered the key factors. His ears turned red and he covered his lips with his fist subconsciously, coughing a few times covertly. His eyes were erratic and after some thought, they finally settled down. He peeked at her from the side and asked, "Ahem, does it still hurt for you?" "I didn't think about that. If it's inconvenient, we can go next time." Chen Jinyao's eyelashes trembled. Then, her cheeks slowly warmed up. Yan Cheng answered the question himself. "You should probably be fine after rubbing some ointment on it." A bewildering rush of embarrassment washed over. Chen Jinyao was silent. "Do you have a needle and thread?" Yan Cheng raised a brow. "I think so." "Why?" Chen Jinyao's face was solemn. "Go sew up your mouth." Yan Cheng, Sunday was a nice and sunny day. The air in the capital was fresh for once. In the morning, Yan Cheng reluctantly followed Chen Jinyao's suggestion. It was a good idea to give the word date some amount of respect. You had to wash your hair, take a shower, and also go through your wardrobe to pick out your most handsome or beautiful clothes. "You women are just troublesome," young Master Yan said. Chen Jinyao frowned and caught onto the keyword. "You women." Yen Qing said, "There's my mom too." Oh. There was silence for a few moments. Chen Jinniao was drawing her eyeliner on in front of the mirror, patiently teaching her husband, "You have to understand that the time a woman takes to prepare before her date is the amount she values the date. And for that reason, you should be happy." Chapter 60. The ending of the date. 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In reality, as a typical straight man, Yen Cheng had many stereotypical opinions about a woman's mind. Their conversation went around and around in circles as the car drove toward their destination. By the time Chen Jinniao concluded that his general belief was, women are selfish creatures who only care about themselves, they had already arrived at the movie theater. She picked up their tickets and dragged him inside the theater room before he could even register what was happening. The theater room was dark save for the small amounts of light coming in from random places outside and the flickering of the large screen in front of them. Tickets had been sold out, and the seats were filled. The movie began. Yen Cheng was silent for roughly 3 seconds before. It's not bad. There was actually another principle. Women attached great importance to the first date. It was no different from going to an interview for the first time. It was not about who their partner was. Sometimes, Chen Jinniao thought that she was pretty heartless. She was capable of being cold and indifferent to everything, to a terrifying extent. She was more willing to believe in the security that the agreement could bring her than what the trammels of emotion could offer. The future of her marriage with Yen Cheng, especially, was still too unpredictable. It would be difficult to pull away if they took love too lightly at the start and actually ended up feeling something. She was used to leaving herself a way out of every situation. Did it make her a hypocrite, she wondered. However, she knew the reason. She lacked a sense of security, and because of it, she would always subconsciously hide in a turtle shell to protect herself. Although she was able to feign calmness, this world was still too unfamiliar to her. Unfamiliar places, unfamiliar people, unfamiliar, everything. "Yencheng, I'm trying to like you," she said. She was also trying to treat their marriage seriously and properly as a wife should. However, she still needed a little more time. After a long pause, Yencheng responded, "Oh, me too." Somehow, all of a sudden, the temperature around them seemed to have dropped. Chen Jinniao shrunk her neck, burying half of her face in her scarf, and sighed. Toward the end of the movie, the audience in the theater room became restless. This movie was the finale of a very popular franchise series, but for some reason, the director decided to turn the ending into a story about family ethics and love. Many people were disappointed. When they left the movie theater, the sky was already dark. The hustle and bustle of the city center had just begun. It was as though a carnival needed to be held every night before the city could fall into a deep slumber. However, the city folks were accustomed to this liveliness. This carnival would not end until much later. The night was cool, and a motley of bright colors stretched into the distance as far as the eye could see. Yencheng took Chen Jinniao by the hand and led her through the crowd, telling her that there was a noodle shop nearby with delicious beef noodles. She lifted an eyebrow and nodded. Then, they stopped talking. Feeling the burning temperature on her palm, Chen Jinniao couldn't help but look down at their intertwined hands. Shortly after, she lifted her gaze to the beautiful side profile of the man's face. There was actually no reason for this. Women were simply emotionally sensitive creatures. No matter how calm, they were prone to indulging in flights of fancy. Chen Jinniao shook his arm, and he immediately slowed down. Yet when he looked at her, she suddenly didn't know what to say. It wasn't until several seconds later that she dared to look at him again. She told him in a solemn tone, "I said that I would try to like you. It's because I'm confident that familiarity breeds fondness." In an instant, the air froze. After a short silence, he laughed, not bothering to give her any face. Then, he reached out and pinched her cheek. "I have a question," he said casually. She frowned and batted his hand away. "What?" This so-called familiarity breeds fondness. He stopped walking and looked down at her. The first word. Do you mean physically, or emotionally?